Every time we discuss Syria on this programme, and sadly there have been far too many times, more bodies have been ripped apart, more children killed before they've ever really lived. So who is trying to stop the carnage, really stop it? Has anybody got a half-decent idea? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. It is right on Europe's doorstep, but European countries do not seem to have that much say on what is happening in Syria. Iran, the US, Russia, Turkey, Gulf nations are variously blasting away their proxy enemies, while Europeans are described as having, quote, inoculated ourselves against shame. Separated from Syria by only the Mediterranean Sea. Ever since the start of the conflict, Europe has kept its distance, building walls, pulling up bridges to those fleeing the violence. So should Europe have done more to bring an end to the war in Syria? After the Second World War, Europe said, never again. But for the past 7 years, a conflict has been raging on its doorstep, and it's been accused of being slow to act.
Increasingly, what we have seen from Europe is that it is divided and it is marginalised in terms of a role in Syria. It cannot compete with the major international powers like the United States and Russia, nor the regional actors who have so much more of a bigger stake on the ground.
Both ends of the political spectrum have a policy of not interfering. The nationalist far right has been bolstered by the fallout of the conflict, while left-leaning governments point to the legacies of past interventions in Iraq, in Libya. Politically and militarily, Europe's involvement has been reluctant. As refugees have arrived at its shores and borders, initially welcoming, Germany faced a swift backlash. Anti-immigrant sentiment helped push Britain to vote to leave the European Union, and walls went up across Europe. Bashar al-Assad has held on to power since fighting began. In 2013, British politicians voted against a motion to remove him. The British opposition saying that more compelling evidence of chemical weapons was needed. Germany said it would send in 1,200 soldiers to fight Islamic State, but fell short of a direct attack on the Assad regime. France has been the most active Western player in the conflict so far. It was early in calling for Bashar al-Assad to step down, leading the dictator to call France the standard bearer of support for terrorism in Syria. But it was left isolated after the Obama administration failed to act. Critics say Europe should have flexed its diplomatic muscles.
Europe could have made a difference by reaching out to Russia, perhaps, earlier on. Many people would argue that Russia, very early on in the Syria crisis, felt that it was its enemies that were confronting it over Syria, and nobody was reaching out to the one power that perhaps knew Syria best.
In 2014, the EU mobilized in the region in the fight against ISIS. The European Union may have imposed sanctions on the Syrian regime and its allies, but it hasn't prevented airstrikes. As Turkey, Russia, and Iran play a central role in peace talks, Europe must decide what role it will take in Syria's future, if any. And joining me from Brussels, we have Julian Barnes, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. With me at the round table, Mohammad Najjar from the Syrian Parliamentary Affairs Group. We have also Dr Andreas Krieg, who's Middle East Defence and Security Analyst at King's College London, and Haitham al-Sibahi, a researcher and also pro-Syrian government, a researcher into Syrian affairs. And thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Can I put this to you first of all? You have said that you believe the UK, and I believe by extension Europe, actually wants to prolong the war. What are you talking about?
Well, starting from the beginning, I mean, United States handed the file to Qatar. Qatar went to the Arab League and to the Security Council afterwards, and nothing came out of that. And we all remember the famous vote in the British Parliament against interfering or joining the America to bomb Syria. So I believe the British after that took the back seats and went few times to the Security Council just to expose the Russians, not to solve the Syrian problems. And they sweeten also to their allies, which is the Saudis and the Qatars, and they played good game there between the Qatari and the Saudis.
But the basic point is, why would Europe want to extend the war, not see it end?
Because everyone, after the first and the second year, the Gulf has supplied a huge amount of money. Was the main thing is the arms from Croatia, from Bulgaria, from various countries through intelligence. Also was the dealing with the Iranians on a nuclear issue. And all this politics...
So they've seen it as a side issue to some extent. Have they something they don't need to focus their full attention on?
No, they have used the proxy on the Syrian ground by... In the background, they supplied arms, they supplied money, they helped their allies, Saudi and Qataris and others for the supplies, and they dealt with the Turks. So was beneficiary to them, as the benefit coming out of it was more important than...
Yeah, well, I expect you to disagree. I expect you to disagree, but give us your thought.
All what our colleague here had said is in favor of the Assad regime. They have actually, if they are trying to extend the war, this is in favor of Assad. They have allowed him to arm himself, to equip himself to the highest level, and to get all militias and all kinds of support. They have covered him politically, and they still acknowledge him as the legitimate president of Syria, despite the fact that he is just a pawn in the hands of the Iranians and the Russians.
Okay, we've seen claim, counterclaim, and that is where we're going. That isn't where we're going on this program.
About international politics.
That is not where we're going on this program. We are trying to explore whether there are any initiatives to actually stop it. And Julian, let me come to you right now, because I said, I quoted somebody in the introduction saying the Europeans have inoculated themselves against shame, and yet we are seeing some movement now, perhaps from France with Macron, and we've had former President Hollande saying Europe now needs to do something. What realistically, if it is a French initiative, does it believe can be done?
Well, the French are, under Macron, looking to get themselves in the game, because the Europeans, as you said, have been out of this for so long, and they haven't played a relevant role, and they haven't made a difference. Macron believes that France can be more assertive, can try and shape things in a more constructive way. I think, quite importantly, he differs from his predecessor, Hollande, in very meaningful ways. Hollande was very much wholeheartedly in support of the opposition and the need to get rid of Assad. Macron is already taking a much more pragmatic view.
And Andreas, we heard from Julian there that Macron is perhaps being pragmatic, and in the same breath he also says, and perhaps that means Assad having to stay where he is for the time being. Is there a general international assumption now that removing President Assad from power is something to be forgotten?
Yes. I mean, first of all, this was a revolution that turned into a counter-revolution, that turned into what we in the West now consider to be a civil war, where both sides have now almost equal weighting. I mean, I think the West has completely forgotten that Assad actually started this through violence, and he kind of created counter-violence. Initially, the West had, I would say, never had a strategy. Strategy means you have a clear objective, you have a clear end game, you have means and ways available to actually achieve it. And I think the West never had this kind of strategy. It was salami tactics. The Obama administration was allowing the Qataris and the Saudis to do a little bit here and a little bit there, but never comprehensively. There was never a comprehensive, serious strategy. There were red lines in the sand that the Obama administration didn't follow up on. Trump is now someone who says he wants to take a more assertive stance. We've seen yesterday Nikki Haley saying in the UN that America will do more now and they will have punitive airstrikes. all these things are piecemeal in the broader scheme of things. I mean, we need to understand that within Syria now, the West doesn't play any role. Neither the Americans and definitely not the Europeans.
You see, this is what I don't understand. This is not just a Middle East crisis. This is a European crisis.
It's a world war.
You could claim it's a world war with all the different countries involved, but it is definitely a European crisis. So why hasn't somebody worked this out?
Well, I mean, the only interest that the Europeans have, and they should have, is the migration issue. It has created a backlash of migrants coming into Europe. The Germans have taken most of this. But who has actually taken most of the migrants? It's Turkey and Lebanon, small countries right on the border. And there's been a deal between Turkey and the European Union to basically keep the migrants where they are. And this is all that matters. I mean, honestly, I do think that the Europeans have sold out. They've gotten a Nobel Peace Prize. I think they've sold out on values and said, you know, as long as this is a contained issue within Syria, we can leave it as it is.
I'll come back to you in just a minute, but I want to put this to Haitham. European insouciance, you know, the fact that it didn't really seem to care. Do you believe that that's handed President Assad a victory, even if it is a Pyrrhic victory, a victory of sorts?
Oh, in 2013, I mean, the Syrian government wasn't in a good situation. And they tried in every venue to try to get some sort of political deal, but they couldn't. So they had no choice but to call on their allies, like the Iranians and the Russians, to come and help, because the Syrian ground had become parties, terrorist groups, like ISIS, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda. By the way, today Al-Nusra is right on the border, which part of Al-Qaeda is right on the border.
But is this a victory of sorts? Is this a victory of sorts right now?
Well, the Syrian army has advanced. In some point, they hold only 35% of the Syrian soil, and now it's become more than 80%. So they are doing the job, and the areas they take in, like Aleppo and other areas, those areas, they are thriving at the moment. They're rebuilding. They are peaceful, apart of car bomb here and car bomb there from.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's not as it was, but it's not anywhere near as it should be up in Aleppo. Yeah. Now, I mean, I know you take issue with this because children are still dying in the war, being bombed by Syrian,
there's no nice
by Syrian forces. But
of course.
In terms of the opposition, this has been a catastrophic failure, hasn't it? And Europe's to blame.
Well, the end of the war is not very clear, and as we have said in the beginning, the agenda, or the Western agenda in Syria, has been set since the beginning, since the first few days. And Robert Ford, the ambassador to Syria, to Damascus, had clearly stated the American stance regarding the Syrian revolution. And he said that you will not be armed, the regime is not going to be changed. So basically, the red line in Syria is freedom and democracy, and the Sunni people who have been repeatedly actually said by Lavrov and Kerry, and has been an agreement upon this, that Syrian people cannot govern their country, cannot be free.
I'm used to people not really answering the questions, but which I ask as the host of this programme. But the fact is, I'm putting it to you again, this has been a catastrophic failure, and somebody other than just the Syrian rebel forces and the Syrian opposition is to blame for that.
Well, actually, I agree with that to a certain point, but remember, you have a superpower backing the Assad regime in Syria, continuous bombardment, barbaric actions against civilians. What do you expect? People under siege for 5 years, what do you expect them to do? They are heroes, and they are still actually writing history in those parts of Syria, in Ghouta and other places in Syria. And I can assure you, if the aerial bombardment, Russian aerial bombardment, stops this evening, the opposition forces will take so many areas that have been lost for the Assad and for the militias.
Well, okay, I mean, you know, if there is no opposition, then you can retake territory. I mean, that probably goes without saying. Julian, where could this have been handled differently and better?
Well, I mean, I think it was clear, particularly in retrospect, but it should have been clearer earlier on that Assad was always stronger than most people in the West, in particular, framed him to be. And I think the moment that the Iranians and then the Russians got involved behind him, the notion of regime change was clearly off the table. So there needed to be a recalibration of expectations, despite the fact that clearly the regime and its allies bear the responsibility for the horrors that have unfolded in Syria. So long as we've clung to a line that said that Assad must go, we've effectively cornered ourselves. So I think only now of late do we see a shift of focus where you see Geneva talk to the UN, talking about constitutional reforms and elections rather than regime change. As I said, I think President Macron now is thinking about more pragmatic ways of getting around the Assad question. So long as we've been fixated on that, it's been a dead end, and a dead end that has only, in a sense, powered Assad's zero-sum vision, and one that has really given him leverage over the Russians and the Iranians to keep on going with the military fight.
After 1945, the Europeans said never again, but in a sense we're seeing the same sort of thing unfolding. And going to what you said about the pragmatic approach again, effectively, will we see, I mean, I know Macron's not at war, but will we see somebody having to sue for peace, not on necessarily favourable terms? A few changes here and there, and we say, OK, we've sorted it, and it's a complete smokescreen.
So the most important parties here on the table are the Assad regime, unfortunately. It is Iran and Russia. And then the minor player is the United States, who are only involved through proxies with few special forces, so they don't have a lever to pull militarily. So they are not going to be on the table, at the table. The French and the British are not at the table at all. So anything Macron wants to do...
Who is at the table?
Who is at the table? I think it is Turkey, Iran, Russia, and possibly the Assad regime. Unfortunately, and because the tide has turned so massively, the Gulf states have somewhat disappeared, their proxies have disappeared, and I think we're now at a place where most people realize pragmatically, and that goes for Macron as well, that we probably have to think about a minor change in terms of the way the regime looks. And I think the Iranians are the only
Cosmetic change.
Cosmetic change, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the Iranians are saying, keep the regime in place. We want Assad in place. Even the Russians, I think, are willing to negotiate about Assad.
You see, sorry, Haitham, can I just bring you in? Yeah, we'll come back to that if we may. See, one of the major concerns is, I mean, we've pretty much established at this table that things are not going to go the way of the opposition, that the rebel forces are not going to win, even though we've heard from Mohammed that if the bombing stopped, then the opposition would walk back into a lot of places. Now, one of the concerns is that with cosmetic changes only, what we're going to see is perhaps an end, to quote the civil war, but retribution from the president's regime for those who had the temerity to take him on.
Yeah, well, thinking about it, I mean, in the last 6 or 7 years, what we heard about we're going to airstrike, send cruise missiles, attack, and Macron even is talking about some sort of strikes now. No one is talking about human rights, talking about a peaceful solution,
hang on,
talking, sit around the table.
Isn't the regime, and I know accusations have been placed at the foot of the opposition as well, but isn't the regime responsible for human rights as well? And it could take on those people it assumed to have had the temerity to have challenged it and impose even more human rights. What we're seeing in Eastern Ghouta with the civilians there.
They asked the government first to release people from prison, which it did. Now they're blaming them, some of those, they are Islamists. They asked...
We're talking about revenge. We're talking about revenge.
Revenge of the Syrian government?
Of the Assad forces, the Assad regime.
There is no revenge. Every area the Syrian Arab army, they say, took is the areas. Look at Aleppo. See the people. Why don't these people send some reports to Aleppo? And actually some TV's been there. They're rebuilding. Lots of areas they're rebuilding. When the ISIS took Palmyra, no one said anything. Everyone was worried about a few stones here and there and some heritage getting damaged. But they didn't say anything about when they see a little children of ISIS shooting Syrian soldiers. When al-Nusra attacked and all this.
But I've seen pictures of civilians, children amongst them, being carted into hospital or to funeral parlours in Eastern Ghouta in the last couple of weeks.
This is
regime bombing.
There is a war in Ghouta is going on.
Not both at the same time. Not both at the same time.
There is a war in Ghouta. There is a few thousands or tens of thousands of people in Ghouta, and there is 7 to 8 million people in Damascus. Those 8 million in Damascus, they've been held to ransom in the last 2-3 months, throwing at them some mortars, some grade missiles daily. Even this morning.
What about gas and chemical weapons?
There's no gas and chemical weapons.
Is there anything gas and chemical weapons? You have killed 1,500 people in 5 minutes.
Excuse me.
You are a loyalist.
Please,
I'm not talking. You represent the Assad regime.
Well,
I
one second, please.
Yeah.
1 second, please. Is there anything, because I want to bring this back to sort of culpability, not in terms of sort of who's dropped what on whom, because we know the accusations fly backwards and forwards, but in terms of who could have done something to change what we're seeing now. And we're talking about Europe in this particular case. Yeah. So is there something that Europe could have done that it hasn't done? I put the question to Julian, and I'm putting it to you now.
Okay. Oh, please. Asking me now. Yes. I think we were talking about this proxy war, which has served the Assad regime big time, and that is something that has been going on for years and years. What can be done, actually, is for the Europeans to say to the Americans, you need to take a stance, you need to take action against the Assad regime and allow the Syrian people to defend themselves. Why are you...
So you want the war to continue, even though perhaps
because there's no way.
It's not winnable.
If you want to stop the genocide, and if everyone is not interested and doesn't care, actually, in doing something for the innocent people of Syria, this proxy war is fueled by the Syrian blood.
Okay,
and
well,
this is actually available and is free. You don't pay anything.
Let me ask you this question. You say the Europeans should put pressure on the United States to do something to prevent what you describe as genocide. What's the likelihood of that?
Is not likely to happen because the agenda has been set. And I slightly disagree with Andreas that the Americans are a secondary player. I think since the beginning the United States gave the green light. And actually I'll give you an example. When the head of the Supreme Commission of Negotiations, Mr. Riyad Hijab, has met with John Kerry before he's left his office, John Kerry literally said to Riyad Hijab, you need to accept what the Russians are offering you. Basically, in different terms, he is saying to the Syrian people, you need to surrender. And actually, this was the moment that the Saudis, with the Americans, with the Russians, with all the big players, have decided to change Riyad Hijab and bring somebody else that has been actually designed to fit the job.
So you don't think it's likely that the European Union will either put pressure on the United States, or if it does put pressure on it, it will be successful? Julian, I'll come to you in just a minute, but Andreas, on that point first, and then come back.
On that point, I do agree with you to that extent that the Americans have played a role, and they should play a role. They're the predominant, apparently the superpower. But if we just look at...
The moment they didn't go in after that red line, supposedly...
Exactly. I mean, first of all, they lost their credibility. Look at what levers of power they can actually pull
but we're
talking
Europe. We're talking Europe specifically in this. Can Europe put any pressure on the United States? Will the United States listen?
I mean,
the United States interested?
We have a huge dispute now on all kinds of issues between Donald Trump and the European Union, and I think Syria is really a tiny side note in the bigger scheme of things, and I think that is the issue. The European Union doesn't have the leverage to do anything against Donald Trump.
What about Russia? What about Iran? What about the...
I think Iran and Russia are probably more likely to listen to European advances than Donald Trump, I'd say.
And what would the European Union say to Iran and Russia?
I mean,
that is remotely interesting to either of them.
I agree.
I mean, to the Iranians, I think the most important thing here is, again, the nuclear deal, and anything will be done to secure the nuclear deal. Again, with the Russians, I think it's about, and that's what Macron wants to do. He wants to talk to the Russians and say, maybe we can find an inclusive solution with Iran and with the Russians to discuss on how Syria can go
Julian,
forward.
backdoor diplomacy. I suppose all diplomacy is backdoor by its very nature.
Well, I mean, from a European perspective, backdoor, front door, I'm not sure, but I think you're still going to get stuck at the same issue again and again, which is the Europeans nor the Americans do not have the leverage to extract the kind of concessions that they want out of the Russians and the regime and the Iranians. So frankly, if you are going to try and do some diplomacy, it's going to have to be on the regime's terms.
Mohammed, how are we looking at expressions of regret from the European Union, perhaps from other partners in the West, that are simply crocodile tears?
Exactly. This is exactly what describes the situation. Instead of shedding these crocodile tears, you can hand over just a few anti-aircraft missiles to the Syrian opposition and stop the bombardment. We are not trying to prolong the war, as people would claim. The situation is so critical, and the genocide that has been going on for entire 7 years. 7 years. We have lost over 1 million people. We have an army of disabled and handicapped people. Europe is not actually doing much, and is not going to do anything really, but they can actually help the Syrian opposition and the Syrian people, allow them to arm themselves and allow them to defend their existence and their land and their future.
Could I come in on this?
Of course, Julian, I would love it if you could. I don't know whether that was you talking, but
yes,
Haitham, I'm going to have to allow you a chance to respond.
I was just going to say that, frankly, military support to the opposition is off the table. That's a non-starter. So I think if we're going to be constructive going forward, one's going to have to think about how we'll work around.
Okay, I know everybody wants to continue talking. Unfortunately, the talking's got very few people nowhere over the last 7 years, and it's cost an awful lot of people their lives and a terrible destruction of a wonderful country. We've been talking about Syria. Sadly, we've talked about it far too much since 2011. But thanks for your company. Thank you all for taking part in this. From me, David Foster, and the team. Bye-bye for now.